My name is James Porter. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of man people describe as reliable, sometimes before they describe me as anything else. I work in a field that values structure, foresight, and calm decision making. I don't dominate conversations. I don't compete for attention. I listen, I observe, and I handle what needs to be handled without announcing it. That quiet way of moving through life has led people to underestimate me more times than I can count. To some, I've always seemed predictable, safe, the kind of man who will absorb inconvenience so others don't have to feel it, the kind who doesn't make scenes, the kind who stays reasonable even when things stop being fair. What most people never realize is that silence doesn't mean absence of thought, and calm doesn't mean lack of resolve. This isn't a story about anger. It isn't a story about revenge, humiliation, or dramatic justice. It's about something far less theatrical and far more permanent: awareness. The moment you stop explaining yourself, the moment you stop trying to preserve an image that no longer protects you, the moment you realize that home didn't feel like home anymore and that feeling wasn't temporary. My wife moved her boyfriend into our house while I was on a business trip. Nothing happened all at once. It unfolded in small shifts, changes in tone, assumptions quietly made on my behalf, boundaries that disappeared without discussion. There were moments I noticed and chose not to challenge. Moments others dismissed as harmless. Moments I recorded internally, not emotionally. Because when you live long enough as the reasonable one, you learn the value of patience not as weakness but as positioning. This story follows that progression. Who I was to them before anything broke. The first subtle moment that told me something was wrong. How disrespect can become normalized when silence is mistaken for consent. How a role can be assigned to you without your agreement, and how long it can take to notice that you've been cast. You'll hear about a shift that didn't involve confrontation, about the silence that became intentional, about preparation that looked like compliance, and eventually about decisions made without spectacle, decisions that didn't need validation to be final. I'm not here to make anyone a villain. I'm not here to rewrite history to make myself look heroic. I'm here to tell the truth as clearly as I can, without exaggeration or cruelty. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let events speak for themselves and walk away without trying to control the narrative. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, quietly, honestly. Have you ever realized that people didn't misunderstand you? They simply relied on you staying silent? Before anything broke, before anyone crossed a line out loud, I was useful. That's the simplest way to explain who I was to them. I was the husband who handled logistics without being asked, bills paid on time, calendars aligned, travel arranged. Problems were resolved quietly before they became problems at all. I didn't announce the effort. I didn't expect praise. I believed genuinely that contribution was its own language. To my wife, I was stability, not passion, not mystery. Stability, the kind that allows other things to feel exciting by comparison. I made the house run smoothly enough that she didn't have to think about how it ran at all. When something worked, it was invisible. When something failed, it was noticeable. I rarely failed. To her friends, I was nice. That word that sounds kind but carries no weight. Nice meant I didn't challenge group decisions. Nice meant I smiled when plans changed at the last minute. Nice meant I was dependable enough to watch the house, drive someone to the airport, or stay home when everyone else went out. Nice was not a compliment. It was a category. At work, I was respected, but quietly. The man who fixed things behind the scenes, the one leadership trusted with sensitive processes because I didn't talk about them. I wasn't the face of success, I was the infrastructure. Necessary, but never celebrated. And I accepted all of this without resentment. That's important to say. I wasn't bitter, I wasn't keeping score. I believed this was what maturity looked like. Choosing consistency over ego, calm over drama. I believed that being solid would eventually be recognized as valuable in itself. What I didn't realize was that invisibility, once normalized, becomes expectation. Over time, people stopped asking what I wanted. Not because they were cruel, but because I rarely interrupted the flow of things. I didn't insist on space, I adapted. When you adapt too well, people forget you're adapting at all. Conversations about our home began happening around me instead of with me. Decisions were framed as conclusions by the time they reached my ears. "We talked about it," she'd say, without noticing that "we" didn't include me. I told myself it was efficiency, that not every detail needed my input, that trust meant letting go. I didn't notice the shift right away because it didn't arrive as disrespect. It arrived as an assumption. Assumption that I'd be fine. Assumption that I wouldn't mind. Assumption that I'd understand. And I usually did. I had a reputation for being reasonable, and that reputation preceded me into every room. It softened expectations others had of themselves. If James is okay with it, then it must be okay. If James doesn't object, then it must not matter. The truth is, I noticed everything. I noticed that when my opinion was summarized, it was instead quoted. I noticed when my presence became optional. I noticed how often gratitude was implied instead of expressed. I noticed how easily my silence filled the space where boundaries should have been. But noticing isn't the same as reacting. And reacting wasn't my instinct. I believed that showing patience would preserve respect, that staying calm would keep me centered, that being indispensable would make me irreplaceable. I didn't yet understand that usefulness can quietly replace intimacy, that being relied on is not the same as being considered, that when people stop seeing you as someone who might leave, they stop asking what would make you stay. Looking back now, there was nothing dramatic about who I was to them. No cruelty, no malice, just a gradual reduction from partner to function, from presence to utility. And the most dangerous part? Everyone, including me, thought that was normal. I didn't feel wronged. I felt settled, positioned, quietly placed into a role I never consciously agreed to, but never refused either. At the time, I would have told you I was content. Only later did I understand the difference between contentment and absence. The first moment that stayed with me didn't announce itself as betrayal. It didn't even feel like disrespect at the time. It was small enough to dismiss, quiet enough to explain away. That's why it lasted. I was packing for a 3-day business trip, nothing unusual. I traveled often enough that it had become routine. I folded shirts the same way every time, lined up chargers on the dresser, and left a printed itinerary on the kitchen counter in case of emergencies. My wife sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone, half listening as I talked through the schedule. "I might be hard to reach Tuesday afternoon," I said. "The audit runs long." She nodded without looking up. "That's fine." The words themselves were harmless. It was the tone that lingered, flat, preoccupied, already elsewhere. I told myself I was projecting, that not every moment needed emotional calibration. Still, I noticed. Later that evening, her phone buzzed again. She smiled, not broadly, not obviously, but enough that I caught it out of the corner of my eye. A reflex smile, the kind that arrives before thought. When she noticed me looking, she tilted the screen away slightly and stood up. "Just a friend?" she said, unprompted. I didn't ask. That was the cut. Not the message, not the smile, not even the explanation. It was the assumption that I didn't need context. That reassurance could be delivered preemptively, without curiosity on my part, as if my role in that moment was not to understand, but to accept. The next morning, I left early. She was still asleep. I paused in the doorway the way I always did, considering whether to wake her. I didn't. I told myself rest mattered more than ritual. At the airport, I texted when I boarded. No reply. I texted when I landed. A thumbs-up emoji came through hours later. Again, nothing dramatic, just Minimal. I told myself she was busy, that I was reading into the absence because I was tired. Everyone else would have said the same. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't draw concern from witnesses. There's no blood, no urgency, just a faint awareness that something has shifted and a choice about whether to look directly at it. I chose not to. Over the next few weeks, there were other moments like that. Conversations that ended just before something important. Plans were made that I found out about after the fact. A name mentioned casually that I didn't recognize, followed by a quick subject change. None of it rose to the level of accusation. It existed in the realm of probably nothing. And yet I remembered each one. Not emotionally, logistically. I have always had a habit of noting patterns, not because I'm suspicious by nature, but because my work trained me to recognize early indicators. Small inconsistencies matter. Repetition matters. Silence matters when it clusters around the same topics. I didn't confront her because I didn't yet have clarity, and I don't speak without clarity. From the outside, I looked unchanged, supportive, present, reasonable. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't test her with questions. I didn't set traps. I continued to be who I had always been. Inside, something adjusted. Not anger, not fear, alignment. I stopped assuming that what I didn't see didn't exist. I stopped dismissing discomfort as imagination. I didn't accuse, but I also didn't forget. The cut didn't hurt. That's why it mattered. Pain demands reaction. Discomfort invites observation. And I began observing more carefully, not her alone, but the space around us. How easily my steadiness absorbed imbalance. How naturally my silence smoothed over gaps that should have raised questions. No one else noticed anything wrong, which meant that if something was wrong, I would be the only one prepared to see it clearly. What makes disrespect dangerous isn't volume, it's familiarity. Once the first small cut didn't lead to consequences, it created a new baseline. Not consciously, not maliciously, but functionally. The absence of response became a kind of permission. And slowly, what would have once felt questionable began to feel routine. I stayed quiet, and in that quiet, things continued. There were nights she came home later than expected without explanation. Not dramatically late, just late enough that dinner plans dissolved into separate meals. She'd apologize casually, the way people do when they assume forgiveness is automatic. "Time got away from me," she'd say, already moving on. I'd nod. I didn't interrogate time. Her phone became something she carried with intention. Always face down, always within reach. If it buzzed, she'd glance first, then decide whether to respond. I noticed how rarely she left it unattended in shared spaces. I noticed how often she stepped into another room to take calls. I told myself it was privacy. Everyone deserves privacy. That's how rationalization works. It borrows the language of maturity to excuse erosion. Friends started dropping by more often, people I knew mostly, people I didn't know as well. One man in particular appeared in stories with increasing frequency. His name surfaced casually, never introduced with context, as if familiarity could be assumed through repetition alone. "He's funny," she said once, laughing at something on her phone. "That's good," I replied. And it was, on the surface. What I didn't say was that humor had become something she shared elsewhere first. That joy was now reported to me secondhand, like news I was meant to acknowledge rather than participate in. Still, I stayed quiet. Part of me believed that speaking up without proof would make me small, insecure, the kind of man who monitors instead of trusts. I had built my identity on being grounded, on not reacting to shadows. I wasn't going to dismantle that over a feeling I couldn't yet name. So I adapted. I stopped expecting updates. I adjusted schedules without comment. I made fewer assumptions about shared time. I filled gaps with work, with routines, with silence that looked like understanding. From her perspective, things probably felt easier. Less friction. Fewer explanations required. My calm presence created a buffer where accountability should have been. And because I didn't complain, the behavior didn't feel like disrespect. It felt like freedom. That's the quiet trade-off no one talks about. When you're consistently accommodating, people stop noticing the cost. There was a moment, a small one, that clarified this for me. We were at a small gathering sitting across from friends. Conversation drifted toward travel, toward plans. She mentioned an upcoming weekend away. I waited for her to include me. She didn't. Someone asked, "Oh, are you going too, James?" She hesitated, just long enough. "Oh no, he'll probably be working." Probably. Not asked, not discussed, decided. I smiled and nodded, because correcting her in public would have been disruptive, because I didn't want to be the man who made things awkward, because the role I'd been assigned was smoothness, not presence. Inside, something settled. I realized then that my silence had been interpreted not as trust, but as consent. That by not asserting myself early, I had taught the people around me what they could assume. And assumptions, once comfortable, harden quickly. I wasn't being pushed out. I was being stepped around. And the most unsettling part was how natural it all felt to everyone else. I started to understand that staying quiet wasn't preserving peace. It was redefining it. Peace, in this context, meant no resistance. It meant emotional labor done by one person so others could move freely. I didn't feel angry. I felt precise. Because once you see a pattern clearly, you stop arguing with it. You stop trying to correct it emotionally. You start deciding what it means and what you're willing to live inside. I didn't speak up yet, not because I was afraid and not because I was weak, but because I was no longer confused. And clarity, I was learning, changes the purpose of silence entirely. Once you stop being confused, you start noticing structure, not events, roles. I began to see myself the way others had already learned to see me, not as a man with needs or even expectations, but as a fixed element in the environment, like furniture, like lighting, something that contributes to comfort without asking for attention. I was the reliable constant, the man who would still be there regardless of what shifted around him. And that realization didn't come with anger. It came with a kind of quiet embarrassment, not because of what they were doing, but because of how long I'd allowed myself to be framed that way without noticing. In our marriage, my role had narrowed. I was in charge of logistics and stability. I handled repairs. I kept the schedules running. I smoothed out the conflict before it escalated. When she was stressed, I absorbed it. When she was excited, she shared it elsewhere first, then relayed it to me later. I was the place where energy settled after it had already been spent. That role came with an unspoken expectation. I would not disrupt momentum. I would not ask questions that required revisiting decisions. I would not insist on renegotiation once things were already in motion. I realized this the night she mentioned casually that someone might stay over for a few days while I was traveling again. A friend, she said, between leases. It was presented as information, not a question. I remember nodding, then pausing. "Here?" I asked. "Just temporarily," she replied. "It's easier." Easier? Not for me, for the flow of things. She was already explaining logistics, where they'd sleep, how long it would be before I had agreed to anything, and I understood then that my agreement wasn't the missing piece. My silence was. Because in the role I'd been assigned, objection would feel out of character. It would require justification. It would disrupt an assumption that had already settled into place. So I said nothing. Not because I approved, but because I was watching something important reveal itself. At work, I started noticing the same pattern. Colleagues would volunteer me for tasks without asking. Leadership would reference my availability as if it were a resource they owned. "James can handle it," they'd say, and I usually did. The role was consistent across contexts, useful, dependable, quiet, and invisible in decision-making moments. I wasn't offended by the work. I was unsettled by the certainty with which others assumed my compliance, as if my presence alone guaranteed my consent. That's when I understood something critical. Roles, once assigned, are self-reinforcing. People don't wake up and decide to take advantage of you. They simply continue interacting with the version of you that has never objected. And the longer you inhabit that role, the more resistance looks like betrayal. I began to see how carefully everyone around me avoided asking direct questions. Questions create space for no. No. Statements do not. Information delivered late limits options. Plans shared after decisions are made reduce agency without appearing overtly disrespectful. It was efficient, clean, quiet, and it worked because I worked within it. But something else had changed. I was no longer trying to earn my place by being easy to live with. I was no longer measuring my worth by how smoothly things ran. I wasn't angry, but I was done being ambivalent. So I didn't confront, I didn't announce boundaries, I didn't demand recognition. I observed. I let the role continue, intact, unquestioned, because I wanted to understand it fully, to see where its edges were, to see what assumptions rested on my continued silence, and more importantly, to decide, without haste, whether I was willing to keep playing it. Because once you see the role clearly, you're no longer inside it by accident. You're inside it by choice. And I was very close to making a different one. The day something shifted didn't come with a discovery. There was no message I wasn't supposed to see, no confession, no sudden proof that rearranged the world in a single moment. It was quieter than that. I came home early from work on a Thursday. I hadn't planned to leave early. A meeting had been canceled, and for once I didn't fill the extra time with errands or obligations. I just drove home. The house was quiet when I walked in. Shoes by the door that weren't mine. 2 pairs, one familiar, one not. They were positioned casually, as if the space already understood their presence. I stood there longer than necessary, not because I was shocked, but because something inside me slowed down. Not fear, not anger, recognition. I walked in, set my bag down, and listened. Voices came from the kitchen. Her voice was relaxed. His voice, unfamiliar, comfortable. There was laughter, easy, unguarded. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. I turned around and went into the spare room instead, closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed and breathed. Not deeply, just steadily. What surprised me most wasn't what I felt. It was what I didn't feel. No spike of adrenaline, no urge to confront, no racing thoughts about what to say or how to say it. Just a clean, unsettling calm. It wasn't denial, it was alignment. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to articulate before. I was already outside the center of my own home. Not pushed out violently, but repositioned quietly. The house had adjusted around me, and I had adjusted to it, until now. I thought about all the moments I'd rationalized, all the times I'd chosen not to ask, not because I was afraid of the answers, but because I was afraid of becoming someone I didn't recognize, suspicious, reactive, loud. And I realized how carefully I had protected everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. Sitting there, I didn't make any decisions. I didn't plan my next move. I didn't even assign meaning to what I'd heard. I just acknowledged a truth I could no longer ignore. I was no longer a participant. I was a variable being managed. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. I stayed in the spare room longer than necessary, long enough for the laughter to fade, for footsteps to move down the hall, for the house to resume its normal rhythm, as if nothing unusual had happened. When I eventually emerged, she looked surprised, but not guilty. That told me more than any explanation could have. "Oh, you're home early," she said. "Meeting ended," I replied. There was a pause, a brief recalibration. She introduced him then. His name, a handshake, polite, casual, no urgency to explain why he was there. I nodded, shook his hand, said hello. The ease of the moment was almost impressive. Later that night, lying in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling and understood that the shift had already happened. Not in the house, but in me. I stopped asking myself what I should feel. I stopped trying to match my reactions to what others might expect. I let go of the need to perform understanding. I didn't sleep much, but not because my mind was racing. It was because it was quiet, empty, clearing space. By morning, I wasn't angry. I wasn't heartbroken. I was resolved not to leave, not to confront, not yet, but to stop participating in a reality that required my absence to function smoothly. From that day on, silence was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I chose. After that day, nothing on the surface changed. That was the point. I continued my routines. I went to work. I paid bills. I nodded at the right moments. I didn't withdraw affection abruptly or alter my tone. From the outside, I remained exactly who I had always been. But internally, silence stopped being passive. It became deliberate. I no longer stayed quiet to preserve harmony. I stayed quiet to observe outcomes, to see what happened when I stopped filling gaps emotionally, to notice how quickly others moved when they assumed my compliance was permanent. And they moved quickly. He began staying over more often, not announced, just present. His toothbrush appeared in the bathroom, his jacket hung near the door. Small territorial markers that arrived without discussion. Each one landed softly, as if the house itself were accommodating him. No one asked if I was comfortable. Why would they? I had trained them not to. Friends started referring to the arrangement casually. "Oh, he's basically here now," someone said once. Laughing, as if naming a convenience, I smiled. The smile cost me nothing. That was the new equation. Because while everyone else assumed my silence meant surrender, I was gathering information. I watched how decisions were framed, what was presented as temporary versus what was treated as inevitable. I listened to how language shifted. Just for now became, "it makes sense." "We'll see" became, "this is easier." Temporary arrangements have a way of solidifying when no one objects. And I didn't, at least not out loud. What changed was how I documented, how I prepared, how I evaluated my own position. Not emotionally, but structurally. I started paying attention to names on paperwork, to whose name appeared where, to timelines, to the assumptions being made about my continued presence. I wasn't plotting, I was clarifying. At work, my silence began to produce similar effects. I stopped volunteering. I didn't remind people of deadlines they hadn't asked me to manage. I fulfilled my responsibilities precisely, but no more than that. The contrast wasn't dramatic. It was just enough to expose how much had been taken for granted. People interpreted this as me being tired, or distracted, or stressed. No one considered that I might be choosing differently. At home, she became more relaxed. That was the most telling part. My lack of resistance created space for her to settle into a new normal without friction. The house felt different, not tense, but reoriented, like a system that had found a new equilibrium. And I was still there, physically, but no longer compensating for imbalance. The irony is that my silence didn't make me smaller. It made me opaque. No one knew what I was thinking anymore because they had stopped asking long ago, and I stopped offering. That absence of access made others careless. They spoke more freely, planned more openly, assumed more confidently. Silence, when misunderstood, invites exposure. I learned that restraint is often mistaken for inability, that calm is often read as compliance. And that's when people believe you won't act. They stop guarding their behavior. There was no satisfaction in this, no sense of power, just clarity. I realized that I didn't need to argue for respect. I needed to decide what to do with the information being freely given to me. And information, unlike emotion, compounds quietly. By the time anyone might have noticed something was different, the difference was already embedded. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't drawn lines, I hadn't issued ultimatums. I had simply stopped making myself essential to a version of life that no longer included me. And in doing so, I created space. Space to choose what came next without being rushed by anyone else's expectations. Silence was no longer a default. It was leverage, precisely because no one recognized it as such. What they never noticed wasn't a secret plan or a dramatic shift in behavior. It was the accumulation. Preparation rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with urgency or visible intent. It looks like routine, like consistency, like someone continuing to live their life exactly as expected. That's why it worked. While the house adjusted around a new presence, I adjusted inward. I started paying attention to details I had once trusted implicitly. Not because I suspected betrayal in every corner, but because trust without verification had already taught me its limits. I reviewed finances, not obsessively, but thoroughly. Joint accounts, individual accounts, recurring payments. I noticed small changes first. Subscriptions I didn't recognize, grocery totals that didn't align with our usual patterns, and utilities trending upward. None of it was alarming on its own. Together, it formed a picture of assumption, of shared resources being used without shared agreement. I didn't confront, I documented. I made copies of statements, screenshots, dates, not as evidence for a fight, but as context for decisions I might need to make later. I had learned that memory is fragile under stress. Records are not. At home, I observed logistics. Who had keys? Who came and went when I wasn't there? How often I was informed versus how often I discovered. The house had become a shared space without shared governance, and no one seemed to think that was unusual. I listened more carefully to conversations, what was said casually, what was assumed, what was joked about. Humor is revealing when people feel safe. So are offhand remarks, especially the ones delivered without checking whether I was listening. I was always listening. At work, I requested copies of contracts I'd previously handled without question. I reviewed policies related to leave, relocation, and benefits. Not because I planned to use them immediately, but because understanding options changes how you experience time. Urgency fades when paths are visible. I also spoke less about my schedule. I stopped announcing travel plans far in advance. I created pockets of time that belonged only to me, space to think, to align. No one noticed because nothing was missing yet. Emotionally, I detached without withdrawing. That distinction mattered. I didn't punish with silence. I didn't withhold affection to make a point. I simply stopped filling emotional gaps that weren't mine to fill. When conversations drifted into territory that excluded me, I let them. When plans were made without me, I didn't adjust my life to accommodate them. I began living parallel instead of merged. This wasn't coldness. It was recalibration. The most important thing I prepared wasn't paperwork or strategy. It was internal permission. Permission to accept that I didn't need to explain myself to be justified, that I didn't need agreement to make decisions. That being calm didn't obligate me to be endlessly flexible. I realized how often I had waited for the right moment to speak, some future point where clarity and certainty would arrive together. What I learned instead was that certainty is something you build, not something you wait for. By staying quiet, I wasn't avoiding conflict. I was choosing timing. They never noticed because they were comfortable. Comfort dulls perception. When people believe a situation is stable, they stop scanning for risk. They stop protecting boundaries they assume won't be tested. And I didn't test them. I let assumptions stand. I let routines settle. I let confidence grow on their side. Because confidence, when unearned, creates carelessness. There were nights I sat alone in the spare room listening to the house breathe. The sounds of movement, conversation. Life is continuing without my participation, and instead of feeling excluded, I felt free. Free to decide without pressure. Free to prepare without explanation. Free to act without spectacle. They thought nothing was happening because nothing looked like change. But beneath the surface, everything that mattered was aligning. Quietly, methodically, and without the need for anyone else's approval. And when preparation is complete, it doesn't announce itself either. It simply makes the next step inevitable. The reveal didn't come from spying or from a confession forced out of someone under pressure. It came the way most truths do, through quiet alignment of facts that had already been visible, just not yet assembled. One evening, I was alone in the house. She was out. He was with her. They hadn't said where they were going. They didn't need to. That too had become normal. I sat at the dining table with my laptop open, a cup of coffee cooling beside me. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I was reviewing documents I had already gathered: bank statements, account access logs, utility bills, and property records. Things I had every right to look at, things I had once trusted enough not to. What emerged wasn't a scandal. It was structured. I realized that the house, our house, was far more clearly defined on paper than it felt emotionally. Ownership, liability, responsibility. All of it was documented, explicit, and surprisingly unambiguous. The ambiguity existed only in how I had been treated, not in how things were legally and financially arranged. That was the first clarity. The second came when I traced timelines. Not romantic timelines, logistical ones. When certain expenses began, when travel increased, when temporary became recurring, when access was expanded without renegotiation, it formed a clean arc, one that didn't require interpretation. No betrayal montage, no dramatic smoking gun, just consistency. And consistency, I had learned, is its own kind of truth. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel angry. What I felt was relief. The kind that comes when confusion finally lifts. When you stop wondering if you're overreacting, when you realize that your discomfort wasn't a flaw in your character, but a response to misalignment. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time, not thinking about what to do next, thinking about what I now knew for certain. I knew that I had been accommodating a situation that relied on my silence to function. I knew that my presence was being treated as infrastructure, not partnership. I knew that the life continuing around me did not include me as a decision maker. And most importantly, I knew that I didn't need to prove any of this to anyone else. That was the leverage. Not exposure, not confrontation, not forcing acknowledgement. Clarity without dependence. When you reach that point, urgency disappears. You stop feeling the need to act immediately because you're no longer reacting. You're choosing. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The next day, nothing changed on the surface. I went to work, I answered emails, I came home. I nodded, I listened, I participated just enough to remain unremarkable. But inside, the dynamic had already shifted, because leverage isn't about holding something over someone else. It's about knowing you're no longer trapped by uncertainty. They still believed I was tolerating the situation because I had no better option, because I was afraid of disruption, because I needed things to stay as they were. That belief made them careless. And carelessness is generous. I didn't correct assumptions. I didn't hint at awareness. I didn't test reactions. I simply accepted fully that I was done negotiating my own place in a space that no longer considered me central. The reveal wasn't a moment I shared. It was a moment I honored privately. Because once clarity arrives, the only question that matters isn't what did they do. What will I do now knowing this? And I already knew the answer. I just hadn't chosen the moment yet. Clarity narrows your choices. That's something no one tells you. People talk about having options, as if more paths always mean more freedom. In reality, once you understand a situation fully, most paths fall away on their own. What remains are not possibilities, but responsibilities. I reached that point quietly. I remember standing in the kitchen early one morning, the house still asleep, light coming in through the window, coffee brewing, everything outwardly normal. And yet I knew I was standing at a threshold that couldn't be revisited. I listed my options, not emotionally, but practically. I could confront her, lay everything out, ask questions I already knew the answers to, demand explanations that would likely arrive incomplete, shaped by damage control rather than honesty. That path might have produced tears, promises, and a temporary recentering of me in the story. Temporary. I could insist on boundaries, force a renegotiation of space, roles, and expectations. That would require ongoing enforcement, constant vigilance to maintain a position I had already been slowly removed from. It would turn my life into a series of corrections. I could also stay. Stay quiet, stay useful, stay present in a structure that no longer recognizes me as essential. I could continue being the stable background against which other people lived more fully. That option was the easiest, and it was the one that cost the most. The final option was the simplest, and the hardest to reverse. I could leave the role entirely. Not in anger, not in a rush, not with declarations or demands. Just step out. That option didn't require her understanding. It didn't depend on his behavior changing. It didn't ask anyone to acknowledge what they had taken for granted. It only required that I stop participating. I realized then that irreversibility wasn't something to fear. It was something to respect. Some decisions shouldn't be undone, because undoing them would require you to become someone you're no longer willing to be. I didn't want a version of my life where I had to argue for presence. I didn't want intimacy that existed only after confrontation. I didn't want a home that functioned best when I made myself smaller. So I chose the option that didn't ask for permission. I chose to leave the role I'd been assigned. That didn't mean leaving immediately. It meant committing internally to a direction that no longer bent around others' comfort. It meant that every action from that point forward would align with that choice, even if the outcome wasn't yet visible. Once the decision was made, I felt calm. Not relieved, not triumphant, calm. Because indecision is exhausting in ways action is not. When you finally choose, energy returns, focus sharpens, time feels less urgent because you're no longer negotiating with yourself. I didn't announce anything. There was no speech, no ultimatum, no emotional pivot that anyone else could detect. But inside, I stopped weighing her reactions. I stopped wondering how things might look from the outside. I stopped adjusting my behavior to preserve an image that no longer served me. From that moment on, I wasn't preparing to see what would happen. I was preparing to act. And that act, once completed, would not be reversible. Because some doors don't need to be slammed to be closed. They just need to be left behind, quietly, with full awareness of what you're choosing to walk toward instead. Once the decision was made, everything that followed became simple. Not easy, but simple. I didn't rush. Urgency is what people feel when they're still negotiating emotionally. I wasn't. I was aligning actions with a choice I had already settled internally. That meant moving in ways that were precise, quiet, and difficult to misinterpret later. I started with separation, not dramatic separation, but structural. I opened a new account in my own name and redirected my income there. No announcement, no confrontation. Joint obligations continued to be met exactly as before. Nothing broke, nothing stopped. The system kept running, which made the change invisible. I updated access permissions at work, not to restrict others, but to ensure clarity, what I was responsible for and what I wasn't. I stopped absorbing overflow. When tasks weren't mine, I let them remain undone until someone noticed. That took longer than I expected. At home, I began removing personal items gradually, not in boxes, in increments. A jacket here, books there, documents have been moved to a secure place. Things no one would immediately miss, but that mattered to me. I wasn't disappearing, I was disentangling. I scheduled meetings with professionals during lunch hours. Quiet consultations, questions were asked calmly. Options reviewed without panic. I didn't need reassurance. I needed accuracy. I learned what timelines looked like, what steps are required notice, what actions were cleanest. The more I learned, the less emotional weight the situation carried. Knowledge has a way of neutralizing drama. I adjusted my routines. I spent more evenings out, working late, visiting places that belonged only to me. I stopped checking in out of habit. I stopped waiting for updates. I didn't withdraw affection abruptly, but I no longer initiated conversations that led nowhere. From her perspective, I imagine I seemed distant, but not alarmingly so. Still functional, still polite, still present enough not to raise questions. That was intentional. Because when people believe they have time, they don't rush to protect what they assume is secure. He became more comfortable, took up more space, made himself at home in ways that suggested permanence. I watched it happen without reaction. Comfort breeds assumption. Assumption breeds exposure. And still no one noticed. The house continued to operate. Bills were paid. Schedules held. There were no scenes. No tension sharp enough to demand explanation. What changed was invisible. I stopped anchoring the system. One evening, she mentioned future plans, casually, optimistically, something about later this year. I listened, nodded, didn't correct her timeline. There's a particular calm that comes when you know a conversation no longer includes you. Not exclusion, irrelevance. And that's when silence becomes not just a strategy, but a courtesy. I wasn't there to disrupt momentum. I was there to exit cleanly. Every step I took reduced dependency. Every choice removed friction from the path I was preparing to walk. By the time anyone might have noticed the shift, the infrastructure that relied on me would already be gone. And the most important part? I didn't feel like I was taking anything away. I felt like I was returning responsibility to where it had always belonged. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about respecting the fact that some endings don't require witnesses. They just require completion. The first consequences didn't arrive in the form of confrontation. They arrived as an inconvenience. Small disruptions, missed expectations, things are not going quite as smoothly as before. At first, they were brushed off, blamed on timing, on stress, on coincidence. No one connected them to me because no one believed I was capable of withdrawing without warning. That belief worked in my favor. The house began to feel less coordinated. Groceries weren't restocked the way they used to be. Schedules overlapped awkwardly. Small tasks went undone because no one had clearly claimed them. The system I'd quietly maintained didn't collapse, but it wobbled. And wobble creates friction. She mentioned it one evening, not accusingly, more puzzled than upset. "Things just feel a little off lately," she said. "I've been busy," I replied, which was true. He grew more visible in his frustration, not directly at me, but in the way he occupied space. He assumed access. He assumed continuity, and when that continuity faltered, he didn't know how to adjust. He wasn't used to maintaining systems, only benefiting from them. I noticed how often he deferred to her for decisions I used to handle, how often she hesitated, how frequently something small turned into a discussion because no default existed anymore. They were experiencing absence without understanding its source. At work, the same pattern emerged. Deadlines slipped, meetings stalled. Someone finally asked, "Didn't James usually take care of this?" "Yes," someone else said to me. "Yeah, he did." The past tense lingered longer than it should have. No one accused me of anything. They couldn't. I was still doing my job, just not everyone else's. The difference was subtle but cumulative, and cumulative effects demand explanation. She began asking more questions, not about feelings, about logistics, where certain documents were. "Why have certain things not been done yet?" I answered plainly, without defensiveness, without apology. "I didn't realize that was still my responsibility," I said once. She looked surprised, not because of the statement, but because of how reasonable it sounded. That's when concerns started to surface. Not about me, about stability. When people don't value presence, they value predictability. And predictability had begun to erode. The future no longer felt as assured as it once had. Conversations shifted, tone changed. There were moments of quiet tension, pauses where expectations met reality and didn't align. I didn't feel those pauses anymore. I let them sit. The most telling change was how often she checked in, not emotionally, but structurally. "Are you going to be home later? Do you have plans this weekend?" Questions that suggested recalculation. I answered honestly, but briefly. "I'm not sure yet. I have things to take care of." They weren't evasive, they were accurate. And accuracy, when it disrupts assumptions, feels like distance. The house didn't explode into conflict. It didn't need to. The absence of smoothness was enough. People don't notice how much you carry until you stop carrying it. And by the time they do, they're already adjusting, scrambling to reassign weight they never acknowledged was yours. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. I felt confirmation. Confirmation that my presence had been treated as a utility. Confirmation that my silence had been mistaken for permanence. Confirmation that the version of me they were reacting to now was unfamiliar and unsettling. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I was no longer compensating. And that was when they began to realize too late, that something fundamental had already shifted. By the time urgency appeared, the window for negotiation had already closed. It didn't arrive as panic at first. It arrived as recalibration, small attempts to restore balance without acknowledging what had been lost. She became more attentive in practical ways, asked questions she hadn't asked in months, suggested shared plans, offered updates that felt rehearsed, not dishonest, just late. There was a softness in her voice that hadn't been there before, a carefulness, as if she were approaching something fragile without fully understanding what had cracked. "Have you been okay?" she asked one evening. "I'm fine," I said. And I was. That answer unsettled her more than anger would have. Because anger suggests engagement. It suggests there's something left to repair. Calm suggests completion. She began to sense distance, but she misread its cause. She thought it was stress, or fatigue, or resentment I hadn't voiced. So she tried to address those things, offering space or closeness depending on what she thought I might want. What she didn't understand was that the problem wasn't emotional. It was structural. You can't apologize your way back into relevance once someone has stepped out of the system that required their constant input. You can't promise change to a person who has already reorganized their life around the absence of that promise. He started to notice, too. His presence became less confident. He asked questions indirectly, testing the temperature, making jokes that didn't land. He sensed tension but didn't know where it came from. From his perspective, I had always been passive, easy, unthreatening, and now I wasn't reacting at all. That frightened him more than confrontation would have. There was a moment, brief, telling, when she suggested we talk things through. The phrase landed heavily in the air between us. It was an invitation to rewind, to return to a moment before decisions were made. I looked at her and realized something important. She was speaking to a version of me that no longer existed. I didn't refuse the conversation. I didn't accept it either. I simply said, "I don't think there's anything unclear anymore." That was the moment panic arrived. Not loud panic, quiet panic, the kind that shows up as confusion, as repetition, as attempts to reassert normalcy. She tried to laugh more, to initiate routines we hadn't shared in months, to speak in the future tense again. But the future she was referencing had already expired. You can feel when someone is trying to catch up to a decision you made long ago. Their words move faster, their questions pile up, their certainty dissolves. And still I didn't explain. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because an explanation would have implied negotiability. And this wasn't negotiable anymore. I had moved past the point where understanding was required for closure. My clarity didn't depend on her agreement. My peace didn't depend on her remorse. The hardest part, for her, was realizing that there was no single moment she could point to and say, "That's when everything went wrong." There was no argument to relitigate, no fight to reframe, just a slow realization that she had been interacting with a version of me that had already stepped away. Regret arrived late, carrying urgency with it, but urgency doesn't undo preparation, and panic doesn't reverse decisions made in silence. By the time she understood that something fundamental was ending, it had already ended. All that remained was acknowledgement, and that would come not through emotion, but through calm confrontation. The confrontation didn't happen the way people imagine confrontations are supposed to happen. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no demand for explanations that came too late to matter. It happened on a quiet evening, after dinner, when the house felt strangely neutral, like a place waiting to be reassigned. He wasn't there. That was intentional. I had waited for a moment when the conversation wouldn't become performative. She sat across from me at the table, hands folded, posture attentive in a way it hadn't been for a long time. There was tension in her stillness, not anger, not fear, but anticipation. The sense that something was about to be named. "I feel like you've been pulling away," she said carefully. I nodded. "I have." That was it. No softening, no qualifiers. She looked surprised, not by the admission, but by how easily it came, as if she had expected resistance, or denial, or an argument she could navigate. Why? She asked. I took a moment, not to find words, but to choose which ones were necessary. Because I stopped feeling like a participant in my own home, I said, and I don't argue for roles I never agreed to play. She opened her mouth, then closed it, recalibrating. She tried again. We could have talked about this. We could have, I agreed, but that would have required me to interrupt a system that was already working for everyone else. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was heavy, weighted with realization. She started explaining, not defensively, but urgently. Context, intentions, misunderstandings. She wasn't lying, she was reframing, trying to restore symmetry where imbalance had already been accepted as normal. I listened. That surprised her too. When she finished, she looked at me, waiting for reassurance or forgiveness or engagement. I believe you, I said, and that doesn't change anything. That was the moment her composure cracked, not into anger, but into confusion. Then what do you want? She asked. It was an honest question, and that mattered. I want to leave this marriage without turning it into a courtroom, I said, without dragging anyone through humiliation or blame. I want clarity, and I want to move on. The words landed quietly, no echo, no drama. She stared at me, searching for something. Hesitation, perhaps, or emotion she could respond to. There wasn't any. Not because I didn't feel, but because feeling wasn't the point anymore. You're serious, she said. Yes. She asked if there was someone else, if I were doing this to punish her, if I'd planned it. No, I said to all of it. I just reached a point where staying required me to disappear, and I'm not willing to do that anymore. That was the truth, complete, undecorated. There was no apology from me. None was needed. There was no apology from her either, not because she didn't feel regret, but because regret doesn't always translate cleanly into words. We talk logistics, timelines, practicalities, calmly, like two people closing a chapter without tearing the pages. When the conversation ended, nothing felt explosive. It felt final. That's the difference between confrontation fueled by emotion and confrontation guided by clarity. One seeks reaction, the other seeks resolution. I didn't leave the table feeling victorious. I left it feeling aligned, and that was enough. After I left, people expected me to change in visible ways. They expected anger, or sadness, or a kind of hollow relief that announces itself in dramatic gestures, new routines, new obsessions, a visible reinvention. None of that happened. What changed wasn't how I lived, it was how I related to myself. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't adjusting my presence to stabilize anyone else's comfort. I wasn't managing expectations, I wasn't monitoring reactions. My days became quieter, not emptier, but more deliberate. I moved into a small apartment not far from where I'd been living. I furnished it slowly, only what I needed, only what felt intentional. The space felt calm, not because it was new, but because nothing in it required explanation. I didn't rush into rebuilding anything. I didn't need to prove that I was okay. I was okay. Work became clearer, too. I didn't take on more responsibility. I took on the right responsibility. I spoke when my input was needed. I declined when it wasn't. And to my surprise, respect followed. Not immediately, but steadily. Boundaries, I learned, don't reduce your value. They define it. Emotionally, I felt lighter. Not because the past didn't matter, but because it no longer required defense. I could think about my marriage without resentment, without rewriting it to justify my exit. It had been real. It had also ended. Both things could be true. I didn't see myself as someone who had been wronged. I saw myself as someone who had outgrown a structure that relied on my silence. That distinction mattered. It meant I didn't carry bitterness forward. I didn't need closure from anyone else. I had already given it to myself. People sometimes ask if I regret not speaking up sooner. I don't. Not because silence was noble, but because it taught me something essential about myself. It showed me where my boundaries were porous, where I equated calm with acceptance, where I confused being needed with being valued. Those lessons didn't arrive through confrontation. They arrived through stillness. I'm more present now. Not louder, not more forceful. just clearer. I ask questions earlier. I don't assume understanding without confirmation. I don't make myself indispensable to systems that don't acknowledge contribution. And when something doesn't feel like home, whether that's a relationship, a job, or a space, I don't argue with the feeling. I listen to it. I don't need dominance. I don't need control. I don't need to be seen as powerful. I need alignment. That's who I am now. Someone who understands that strength doesn't require volume, that leaving quietly can be an act of self-respect, that walking away without spectacle doesn't mean you lost. It means you chose not to keep losing in small, invisible ways. The house I left no longer feels like mine, but the life I'm living now does. And that, more than anything else, tells me I made the right choice. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to assign blame, to draw clean lines between right and wrong, victim and villain. But life rarely offers that kind of symmetry. What it offers instead are patterns, and the quiet responsibility to notice when we've been living inside one for too long. This story isn't about infidelity alone. It's about erosion, about what happens when presence is mistaken for permanence and silence is mistaken for consent, about how easily people adapt to a version of you that never asks for space, and how uncomfortable it makes them when that version quietly steps away. No one woke up one morning intending to replace me. No one sat down and decided I didn't matter. The shift happened because I allowed myself to become background, because I believed that being reasonable would be enough to be respected, because I thought that if I stayed calm long enough, things would naturally correct themselves. They don't. What corrects imbalance is awareness, followed by choice. The most important lesson I learned wasn't about marriage or betrayal. It was about agency, about the difference between enduring something and choosing it, about how often we stay not because we're committed, but because we're comfortable with the role we've been assigned, even when that role is slowly diminishing us. Leaving didn't make me stronger. Understanding did. Strength came from recognizing that I didn't need to prove anything to justify my exit, that I didn't owe anyone an emotional performance to validate a decision made in clarity, that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for yourself and for others is to stop participating in a dynamic that no longer honors you. I didn't leave to teach a lesson. I left because I had learned one. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Pay attention to how often you are assumed rather than consulted. How often your silence smooths things over at your own expense. How often are you praised for being easy rather than valued for being present? Those patterns don't announce themselves as danger. They arrive as normal, and by the time they feel wrong, they've often already been in place for a long time. You don't need to explode to reclaim yourself. You don't need revenge to restore dignity. You don't need permission to leave a space that no longer feels like home. Sometimes the quietest exit is the clearest statement. If you've listened this far, I'd like to ask you something, not for judgment, but for reflection. Have you ever realized that the moment you stopped explaining yourself was the moment you finally chose yourself? If that question resonates with you, I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments.